Hello, I'm Alice Grundy. I'm a research manager at the Australia Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar from our Transparency Summit in Canberra today. We're on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, where sovereignty was never ceded. My guests today are Kieran Pender, down the far end, who is Associate Legal Director of the Human Rights Law Centre, Isabelle Reinecke, Executive Director and founder of Grata Fund, and next to me is Bill Browne, who's Director of the Australia Institute's Democracy and Accountability Program. So you can register for future Australia Institute webinars on australiainstitute.org.au. Just some tips for Zoom. You can type in questions for our panelists using the Q&A box. You can do that throughout the talk, and you can upvote other people's questions too. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll kick you out. And finally, this is a live event and it's being recorded. The video will be available on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. So a lack of transparency and integrity lies at the heart of every political issue facing Australia, in our climate policies, our defence procurement, and even in how we develop our public policy. Flimsy excuses obscure even flimsier decision-making. So how can we reverse a culture of secrecy? The 2024 Transparency Summit is connecting those who have been stonewalled with an eye to keeping the pressure on all levels of government to ensure the interests of Australians are represented in our policy-making process. So, Bill, can you frame for us the importance of this inaugural Transparency Summit and its timing?
Our motivations for organising the Transparency Summit come first of all to the importance of transparency to Australian democracy. And early opening the summit, Richard Dennis was at pains to talk about how democratic decision-making depends on information about the reasons why government makes decisions, what action government takes, and what's going on in the names of Australians. We've heard from speakers that government is a player in the secrecy space. It's not just that there's institutional inertia. We actually see active measures from government to keep secrets, whether it's the AUKUS nuclear submarine program or the Future Fund trying to keep details of the investment of Australia's sovereign wealth secret and hidden from scrutiny. We also have heard about the interconnectedness of these different secrecy issues. It's a rare speaker today who's talked only about whistleblowing or only about freedom of information, only about government public interest claims. In fact, what's come across all of the sessions so far is that there is no one issue here. The culture of secrecy underpins the whole mix. We've heard accounts of public servants hiding information even when it's already public. The public servants just don't realise yet that it might have been published, for example, on a Royal Commission's submissions page. So ingrained is the idea that information must be kept from the public, and that people don't even check if it's public already. So for those reasons, I think, and more, it's so great that we are joined here together at the Transparency Summit.
And you've talked about some of the key topics, including whistleblowing and freedom of information. What have been some of the key themes that you've noticed so far?
I think an interesting distinction to emerge in Jake Blight's speech was he's the security legislation monitor responsible for overlooking Australia's intelligence laws. The distinction between transparency laws and secrecy laws, which can be conflated. Transparency laws, things like freedom of information, whistleblower protections, and then secrecy laws, those often imposing criminal offences on those revealing information that the government has decided should be secret.
So, Kieran, you were on this morning's panel on the topic of whistleblowing with Professors Alan Fels and AJ Browne and former whistleblower and Transparency International advisor Frank O'Toole. In Australia today, what are the considerations for someone who is thinking about blowing the whistle?
So I thought it was a really interesting discussion this morning, and first just want to underscore, I think, how important it is that we've gathered here today, bringing together people from different sectors to talk about this critical issue of transparency and secrecy in our democracy. Those sometimes seem as abstract values, but it's important we don't forget the real human toll of secrecy and the real impact of not having enough transparency. I think that came through basically in all of the sessions today. Really interesting discussion on whistleblowing. I think the crux of it is our laws are broken, our systems of support for whistleblowers are broken. We know that more is needed. Fortunately, we know what we need to do. It's not rocket science. We know there are...
Just hold on, Kieran. We're having some trouble with the audio for the webinar. We're going to see if we can turn up the sound a little bit and just if you can speak a little bit more closely into the microphone. Thank you.
I hope everyone can hear me now. I think the summary of the panel this morning was that whistleblowing laws are broken. Our support systems for whistleblowers are non-existent. The good news is it's not rocket science. We know what we need to do to fix it. There's reform that's needed. There's the establishment of an independent federal statutory whistleblower protection authority. I think if I was speaking to someone who wanted to blow the whistle, I'd say, talk to me. At the Human Rights Law Centre, we run the Whistleblower Project, Australia's first dedicated pro bono legal service for whistleblowers. But we're a team of 4 people. We can't help everyone. We will help people where we can, but then part of our work is this advocacy, policy, law reform work so that more whistleblowers can get the support they need. We had a really interesting question asked today by someone about some professional codes and codes of ethics for different occupations. Don't just encourage whistleblowing, they actively require whistleblowing, and whether that's something that we should look at. And my response to that question was, that's really commendable, but the starting point has to be that people who want to blow the whistle can get the support they need, because otherwise requiring people to blow the whistle will have no effect if they can't get help in doing it.
And do you think that would be about policy changes in order for them to get that support? What sort of measures do you think need to be in place?
So 30 years ago, a federal parliamentary report said the federal government should enact whistleblower protection and establish a dedicated body to support whistleblowers. Eventually, we got the first. 30 years on, we're still waiting for the second. It's an idea whose time has come. In 2017, there was a multi-partisan parliamentary inquiry that suggested the government set up a whistleblower protection authority. The 2019 election, the Australian Labor Party proposed that they would set up a whistleblower protection authority. We've got similar bodies overseas. We know what needs to be done to protect whistleblowers. That is an independent statutory body that oversees and enforces these laws, provides support services, supports people to get legal advice they need, to get psychological support they need. Blowing the whistle can be a hugely trying ordeal. And there's institutional support that must be provided so that people speak up. And if they don't, because if we don't provide that support, they won't speak up. Too many people are staying silent. We know that. We know that the few cases we do have are really the tip of the iceberg of wrongdoing that's going on, that's going undetected because people are not speaking up. I thought it was really interesting. We had on our panel the former chair of the ACCC, Alan Fels, AO, talking about, from a regulatory perspective, whistleblowers are the lifeblood. You can't detect wrongdoing if you don't have people speaking up. And so that's why this reform is so critical.
And in terms of the coverage of whistleblowing in the media, do you think there needs to be a greater representation of discussions of whistleblowing? Do you think that the general public is getting an understanding of how whistleblowing currently operates or what needs to change?
I think we've had a lot of coverage of recent high-profile cases, and unfortunately, the prosecution of whistleblowers in recent years has had a real chilling effect on people speaking up. Something that I really grapple with in my work is that there are many whistleblowers who speak up, the wrongdoing is addressed, they move on with their lives. And so I don't want people to think that blowing the whistle will inevitably lead to you going to jail. That is not the case. The cases that we've had of people going to jail for blowing the whistle have been exceptional. But unfortunately, the chilling effect is very real. We see that every day in our work, people terrified of speaking up because they see these cases. The challenge that we have is, of course, we acknowledge those cases and we're continuing to call for the government to drop the prosecution of whistleblowers, but there are also good news stories. It's just those stories stay silent because the person speaks up, the wrongdoings dealt with, they move on with their life. So it's, I think, getting that nuance right, making it clear that yes, there are problems, we need to fix the law, we need to establish a whistleblower protection authority, but even today, it's not all bad. And we have many. We launched our service 14 months ago. We've been contacted by about 300 people. We've advised about 100 whistleblowers. We've acted for about 30. We've had lots of good news stories there where people have done the right thing in speaking up. The wrongdoing's been addressed. There's been justice. There's been accountability. That is possible.
Thank you. Isabelle, your panel on freedom of information with former Senator Rex Patrick and Professor John McMillan is coming up this afternoon. What are the problems with freedom of information law and culture in Australia?
It's a big question.
You have a minute and a half. If you could just speak.
Yes, sure. Yeah, we've had a very productive partnership with Rex, which has been great that we'll be able to speak to a bit this afternoon. But I think for Grata, the entry point to the issue with the freedom of information system was how the problems within it were impacting all sorts of different social movements. So whether we spoke to climate change advocates, whether we spoke to people working on over-incarceration of young Aboriginal people, whether we spoke to people working in the refugee sector, every single group of advocates or journalists or academics working on these subjects were being regularly blocked from proper information from the government and government information that they're entitled to on the law. I think we had a sense of frustration that there's such a big gap between what the law says and what the practice is. And for us, we wanted to close that gap. And so we released a kind of a 10-point hit list of the ways that actually a bit of court oversight, given it is sort of the foundational accountability institution that exists in our democracy, needs to happen. Because what was really happening was that people were submitting applications for information, getting blocked and blocked and blocked, eventually blocked at the AAT, and then not going beyond the AAT. And so what we've successfully done with Rex and with Justin Warren is actually prosecute those arguments beyond the AAT level. So getting to the federal court position where some of these kind of loopholes that have developed through practice are getting shut down. And that then reverberates for culture. So as you shut down kind of things that have been allowed to morph very broadly or mushroom into much bigger exemptions that are ever been intended, as you actually have a court saying, no, that doesn't fly, you are actually able to push back on the culture that says, yeah, we can just get away with this and kind of broaden and broaden and broaden. And, you know, a really good example of that is in a case that Rex just won on appeal, which was around an exemption that developed not in law, but through practice by the OAIC and various departments that enabled people to say that documents didn't exist for the purpose of an act if a minister had changed or left their portfolio. And as we know, in contemporary politics, people move portfolio fairly regularly, actually, within a term of government, let alone at the end of a period of government. And what that meant was that anytime you saw some sort of a scandal blow up in any ministerial position, that minister is moved and then everything under that minister becomes exempt according to the OAIC. And what the court has now effectively done twice, first instance and then on appeal, is say actually that's not a legitimate way of shutting down FOI access. And similarly, Justin Warren, his case was really targeting the use of this very expanded definition of cabinet confidentiality in accessing robo-debt documents. And the court again agreed actually with Catherine Holmes's findings in the Royal Commission into robo-debt that actually this expanded definition of cabinet in confidence doesn't hold up under the law. And so I sort of have a bit of faith in returning to the core principles that exist in the statute and, you know, that came about in this sort of unimaginable now sense that, you know, it was a completely bipartisan tool that was adopted 50 years ago, and really returning to those first principles of, you know, what are we actually doing here? What is the point and the principles that we're talking about? And really, as much as you can talk about democracy and transparency, and this audience understands that those things are important in their own right, I think the significant part of why it matters is because it's affecting people's daily lives. It's affecting the rights of, you know, young Aboriginal kids to not be in police watch houses. It's affecting the ability of refugee advocates to advocate on what was happening in offshore detention overseas. I mean, it impacts actually the culture, the way that our stories and history are told. We also supported Jenny Hocking in her Palace Papers case all the way to the High Court, which was excellent because what it showed was actually, no, even archives, you actually do have some responsibility in terms of producing information to the public and for the public good.
And you were talking about the gap between legislation and common practice. Is part of that related to resources? As anyone who has submitted an FOI knows, there will almost always be a delay. Do you think that that's an area that needs to be addressed as well?
Yes, I mean, the resourcing has been dried up intentionally. You can see that very clearly. You know, the most egregious stage was under Tony Abbott, you know, really led to the Information Commissioner at the time having to work out of his home office using his own personal printer because he'd completely been deprived of staffing. And what that speaks to, I think, is a real problem in terms of the way the separation of powers is working in Australia. So that balance between, you know, our ministers and cabinet and the broader parliament. And the parliament has passed legislation that says people should have access to this information. And it is the executive, by starving various agencies and offices of funding, that are essentially getting to influence the good governance of the country. And we don't only see it in the Information Commissioner space. We see it where it's the Bureau of Meteorology being so starved of funding that it can't, you know, accurately predict weather at times. You know, we see it all across our democracy. And it's this real issue of the executive expanding and expanding and expanding and not being pushed back on. And I think really highlighting the importance of the court and if we choose to access it, in having a role in actually correcting that balance is really important.
And in your article in the Monthly earlier this year, you talked about the government's use of NDAs. What role do these play in our democracy at the moment?
NDAs, I suppose, you know, the way that the policy process is meant to work is you know, there's a front door to access and a back door to access. FOI should really kind of be the back door. After things have happened, you want to be able to go back and look. And similarly with whistleblowers, you need a exit valve point through which information can come to light. But the public policy development process is meant to be the point that we can correct things before they go wrong. And the increasing use of NDAs across this government, you know, whether it's NDIS consultations about removing offshore gas approvals from the Environment Department to the Energy Department, you know, whether it's, you know, National Adaptation Plan reviews, I mean, a whole really broad swathe of subjects where the government is stopping that front door of access. Interestingly, another mirror that's going on that's not talked about frequently, but is really emerging, is the abuse of court processes by corporations by using what is supposed to be a transparency tool, the subpoena process in a court case, to access information inappropriately. And we can really see that at the moment happening with Santos's litigation with EDO, where they are Santos is aggressively pursuing subpoenas, both against non-parties to that case and against the EDO. And I would say, you know, there are legitimate legal grounds on which Santos is doing that, but there are also some pretty clear alternative motives and very clear impacts in terms of a chilling effect on the ability of civil society and advocates to actually do the work that they're doing to try and make the country a better place.
Thank you. And Bill, the subject of your talk later today on secrecy is not security. Could you foreshadow a little bit what you'll be covering this afternoon?
So I think often when it comes to government secrets, the attempt is to set up a binary where government transparency comes at the expense of security. And that could mean national security when it's defense, but it could also mean economic security, which is the idea behind any claim of commercial incompetence, or vaguer ideas like kind of harmony and that kind of thing. And what I'm hoping to challenge in the speech is the idea that this is a binary. And you can even see this in the way that the government approaches your secrets. In fact, when it comes to how the government justifies surveillance and oversight of individual citizens, the trade-off they identify is not between transparency and security, but between privacy and security. So your secrets are a threat to security. Their secrets are necessary for security. And examples of that abound. You know, the illegal, illogical, and hugely damaging robo-debt scandal, for example, could happen only because those involved thought that they'd get away with it because of the veil of secrecy. And it took a royal commission to strip back that veil and reveal what was truly happening there. Similarly, when it comes to defence procurement, we're not actually safer as citizens for not knowing the details of the AUKUS nuclear submarines program, or as Senator David Shoebridge raised today, the acquisition of frigates. By avoiding these issues from being ventilated and properly explored, we're saving governments from embarrassment in the short term, but we're not improving the quality of government, and we're doing nothing to keep Australians safer.
I think we'll turn to questions now. And the first one will go to you, Kieran. It's a question about what kinds of changes we can expect in terms of whistleblower legislation when it seems as though current governments are interested in prosecuting some existing whistleblowers. What kind of potential do you think there is for change in this area in the short term?
So the current government, the Albanese government, certainly talks the talk on whistleblower protections as part of their wider commitment to transparency. And of course, we welcome that commitment. Unfortunately, to date, it has failed to walk the walk. We've seen, obviously, the ongoing prosecution of several whistleblowers. The government promised to fix public sector whistleblowing law. We haven't yet seen that. We had some very minor technical reform last year. The clock is ticking with an election due early next year. That reform the government remains committed to, but whether we see it now or early in the next term of Parliament, we'll have to wait and see. There's currently a review of private sector whistleblowing law that's just begun. One of the problems in the whistleblowing landscape is fragmentation. We have now almost 10 federal whistleblowing laws. Just the other day, there was more added. I'm this afternoon having to duck off from the conference very quickly to talk to a Senate committee about aged care whistleblowing. We've got all of these different bits of whistleblowing laws, and that's causing complexity and it's causing fragmentation, and it's not good for people who want to blow the whistle. So a big part of our campaign is saying, look, we've got to harmonise, we've got to simplify, we have to have laws that are accessible and that work. So the government has said it's committed to public sector and private sector review and reform. The government's currently considering whether it thinks it should set up a whistleblower protection authority. Of course, there's more needed. We'll continue to put the pressure on. I think we'll have to see what happens in the next, obviously, the election in relation to who's in power at the next term of government. I think the good and bad thing about whistleblower protection is everyone is committed to it in principle. No one thinks whistleblowers are a bad idea in principle. It's what happens when the rubber hits the road. Our significant private sector whistleblowing regime that was reformed in 2019. Of course, that was under a coalition government. The crossbench is deeply committed to whistleblower protections. I think very shortly at the conference here, Senator David Pocock's going to talk about him and several other members of the crossbench moving forward with a private members bill to set up a whistleblower protection authority. Of course, Andrew Wilkie on the crossbench himself, a former whistleblower. So I have confidence that no matter what happens at the election next year, there will remain a commitment to fixing our whistleblowing laws. But it's a matter of timeliness and of urgency, because for every day that goes on where we don't have good whistleblowing laws and we don't have a whistleblower protection authority, people are staying silent. And that, in unfortunately too many cases, is the rational thing to do, and it's not good for our democracy when whistleblowers stay silent.
And again, perhaps a gap between stated aims and the reality is the current National Anti-Corruption Commission. Bill, would you like to talk a little bit about where we're at in terms of the Australia Institute's advocacy for public hearings, for example?
Some of the clear unfinished business for the National Anti-Corruption Commission when it was legislated is the limitation on public hearings, which have to be not just in the public interest, but are limited to exceptional circumstances only. And the big problem there is that we rely on public hearings for many different parts of the work we expect from the NAC. And we can see that in state level anti-corruption commissions like the New South Wales ICAC, which very effectively uses public hearings. Firstly, there's the confidence that justice is being done because people can witness the commission at work. There's a better sense of what issues the commission is looking into because of the details that are provided to the public about what inquiries are ongoing. And it can also encourage people to come forward with more information. Hearing that there are inquiries into this or that scandal means people who might have information that they can share are likely to come forward. And we've seen that happen with the New South Wales ICAC. On the other hand, in the absence of public hearings, and while the NAC has the ability in limited circumstances to hold public hearings, it hasn't done so yet. In the absence of public hearings, people are left to speculate about what is being investigated or isn't being investigated. And that neither sets the NAC up for success, nor does it encourage confidence in the public more generally.
Isabelle, you spoke a little bit about the AAT. We have a question here saying, will the new ART, which replaces the AAT, be any better? Do you have an opinion on that?
I think it will be. I mean, it's also a measure of how poor a condition the AAT has become.
And sorry, would you mind spelling out the acronyms?
Oh, okay. Yes. Administrative Appeals Tribunal and the Administrative Review Tribunal, I believe, is the new rejigged name. And for those who aren't familiar with the purpose of the AAT or the ART, it's really the first point of call for review of anything that happens with government. So it's hugely significant. Whether you are somebody who has been denied a Centrelink payment and you feel like it's unjust, you've been denied refugee status and you feel that it's unjust, you're a journalist who's been denied access to information that you think you should have access to, that's the place that you go to challenge it. And it means that it's really a hugely important accountability institution for government. And the state that the AAT got into was that it became so politicized through its appointment processes that if you were a person seeking asylum in this country and you sought to review a rejection of your asylum status, you were twice as likely to be rejected if your matter was heard by a coalition appointment than if it wasn't. And that was holding for the normal variation in factors that can lead to a positive or negative decision in a case. So a very profound market difference in the application of correct law. And the issue is, even if you do have a decision that seems a bit iffy at the AAT level, to get to the next stage of the court process, you have to go to the federal court. And that's when things get really expensive. You take on a cost risk if you lose. It's a much more complex process, so you need to pay lawyers a lot more to get through that process. It's not as accessible as the AAT is designed to be. So it's really important that body has a really firm merit-based appointment process, and that it becomes a place where people don't have to go beyond it unnecessarily to get a just outcome. And that's what I really hope the ART will result in. But I think it is something that it's worth thinking about is, I think often in Australia, especially I think people in the centre or centre left tend to take for granted a little the institutions of court and tribunals as being things that are really secure in our democracy. We look very distastefully overseas in America, quite rightly, I think, at the way that their judicial system has disintegrated. But I think we've got to be really alert to the forces at play that do see the effectiveness of influencing the way tribunals and judiciaries operate, and the forces at play that, do look fairly hungrily at what happens in the US. And, I think we've got to wake up a little bit that if these are really important centrist democratic principles and institutions, we've actually got to start saying that and speaking up for them and, really defending them as institutions that are here to serve us. And that's not to say they're perfect, but it is to say that the only way that we push them towards perfection is if we engage with them and operate and seek to work with them as, the core accountability institution in our constitution. I mean, we literally have three branches of government. One is the judiciary. The point of the judiciary should be that you don't need other additional mechanisms. I mean, we still do, but I think it's really about culturally as Australians really accepting and embracing the role of the courts and making sure that they're looked after in a process of extreme politicization.
And you mentioned looking to America. We've had a question about Australia's culture of secrecy relative to other countries. Do you have a thought about whether there are countries on which we should model ourselves and those that we should potentially avoid replicating?
To be honest, I'm much more acutely aware of the ones that we should avoid replicating. And I feel like the US is and obviously an excellent example of that. I think, part of that is because Australia actually was a leader. The way that our system was set up 50 years ago was considered, Australia was a leader rather than the laggard that it's become. And I think that's something that, we need to reflect on in terms of where has Australia gone wrong and how can we actually return to some core principles, which almost sounds like a sort of conservative proposition in the sense that, how do we return to some core principles of 50 years ago? But I think actually that's the place that we're in.
If I can just jump in on that question, I think in some respects, Australia places very poorly compared to our overseas counterparts. So we had a presentation from the National Security Monitor who made the point that Australia has almost 1,000 secrecy offences under federal law. We are probably the liberal democracy with the most discrete secrecy offences. Conversely, we had an American lawyer speak to us via Zoom about the whistleblower awards and incentive programs that in the US have helped taxpayers recover billions of dollars. I know the Australia Institute has just published a new report calling for a whistleblower incentive program in Australia. It's something that the Human Rights Law Centre has for a long time advocated for. Whistleblower protection authorities as concepts. We've seen them in the US, in the Netherlands, in Slovakia, in Ireland, in Finland. We can learn a lot from what other countries are doing. And as Isabelle very rightly pointed out, we once led the way. FOI law was internationally innovative. Australia was the second country in the world to enact whistleblower protections in the early 1990s when Queensland enacted whistleblowing laws. We were a world leader and now we are rapidly falling behind, and that's not good for our democracy.
And looking around the world, we have a question about whether the case of Julian Assange has changed the landscape for whistleblowers, journalists, and the freedom of the press. Kieran, would you like to reflect on that?
It's a good thing that Julian Assange is back in Australia. That's a really welcome development. That was an unjust case that had a profound negative effect on press freedom globally. I don't think it's a good thing for press freedom that he was forced to plead guilty. I think that case remains a stain on press freedom in the United States, and that will continue to have an effect on journalism all around the world. The idea that a journalist or a publisher in any part of the world could find themselves being prosecuted by one of the most powerful countries in the world, in the United States, for journalism that they did, publishing they did, not necessarily in the United States, should worry everyone. That said, it's obviously very welcome that he's back in Australia. I note that his lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, when Julian was released, made the comment that Australia really needs to look in the mirror. Of course, it's been welcome that Australian politicians, including the Prime Minister, have spoken up about the Assange case and have been part of the campaign to bring him home. There was a piece in The Guardian that made the point that as Julian Assange was flying into Canberra Airport, he flew over the prison in Canberra where David McBride, who leaked documents to the ABC that allowed the war crimes reporting, was in prison. Just today, a date's been set for David McBride's appeal that'll be heard in March next year. There is an intense dissonance between the celebration of the return of Julian Assange and the government's role in that and the credit they seek to take for that, and the fact that the first person imprisoned for Australia's role in war crimes in Afghanistan is not a perpetrator of those war crimes, but someone who leaked documents to enable those war crimes to be reported.
I think we have time for one last question. And Bill, we've talked a little bit about the culture in Australia compared with other places in the world. Do you feel as though this is a time for potential change in Australian culture? Do you feel as though the summit is an opportunity to really push that forward?
I think so. Australian Institutes observed that the 2022 election was in many ways the integrity election, defined by a number of scandals and controversies from the previous government. And that theme was picked up, including by Anthony Albanese, then opposition leader. And in my speech later today, I'll make reference to a speech that Anthony Albanese gave in the year that he became opposition leader, where he lays out the value of a culture of disclosure as opposed to a culture of secrecy. So I think there is an understanding that more needs to be done on transparency. But so far, we haven't seen that from the Albanese government. And as we head to an election, probably in early mid next year, I think we're going to see more and more calls for transparency and see transparency rise as more of an election issue. Australia Institute polling research finds overwhelming support among Australians for the prompt processing of FOI requests, and understanding that whistleblowers make Australia safer rather than endangering it, and support for things like a whistleblower protection authority. Overwhelming agreement that public servants misleading Parliament constitutes corrupt conduct. on any kind of transparency issue, when you go to Australians, there's strong support for open government and transparency. And I think that's going to become more and more apparent as we head into the election period.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much to Kieran, Pender, Isabelle, Reinecke and Bill Browne. And thank you so much for joining us today and for your excellent questions. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube, where you can catch all of our webinars, and you can also subscribe to our podcasts, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and After America. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.